In my previous career, I was a trial lawyer. And one of the things that you do as a trial lawyer is you put together your case, but you don't actually get to testify. You don't put on you don't get to talk to the jury and put on evidence. You pick the witnesses. And it occurred to me the other day that in putting together this conference, I've had a lot of input into the speakers and the panelists that we've put together, that I really got the A-team here. So I just want to tell everybody here that I'm very pleased with the range and focus of speakers that we've got. And as you listen to the speakers and the panelists this weekend, I want you to be thinking about something, and I'm going to talk about it in a second, and it's our Wesleyan Statement of Climate Principles. And the way a lot of trials are conducted, the trial lawyer begins the trial by an opening statement where he explains what he or she expects to prove during the trial, and then asks you at the end, in the closing, to vote or affirm his view of the facts. And so what I'm going to do is talk to you a little bit about what I think we're going to show you in the next day or so at the conference, and introduce the Wesleyan Climate Principles. I'm not expecting you to necessarily agree with or go along with exactly what I'm saying here or what we're talking about now, but listen to the speakers and the workshops this weekend and see how you feel, and see if this doesn't start sinking in a way that you agree with. So the three principles that we have distilled down, and there's a lot of discussion about what's important about climate policy, and there's 1,400-page bills that have been introduced on Capitol Hill, but what we tried to do is look at what is absolutely essential in terms of what we need to do to reduce CO2 emissions and get our planet into balance in terms of climate. And economists and pretty much everybody who's looked at this will tell you that the first thing, the most important thing, is to put a price on CO2 pollution so that alternatives, low carbon alternatives, have a chance to grow and replace the dirty fossil fuels, the dirty energy that is hurting our planet's climate and creating, I don't even like global warming. I go further. I go along with the scientists now who are calling it global climate disruption. I think that's a much more descriptive term. So the three elements are a price on carbon. To be effective, a price on carbon, whether it's a fee or a tax, needs to be upstream, direct, steadily increasing, and calibrated to reduce emissions to levels called for by climate science consensus, with border adjustments or other mechanisms to reflect differences in carbon prices and policies in other nations. So that's a price that we can impose on carbon within our country and encourage other countries to do so by the border adjustments. The second principle is returning revenue, and that can be done either through a dividend or a tax reduction to consumers. The vast majority of revenues are to be returned to consumers either directly via a dividend or via tax reduction called a tax shift, with a small portion allocated to a single fund for climate purposes such as transition assistance for affected communities, international adaptation, mitigation, research and development, low carbon energy research, and targeted cost-effective energy efficiency investments. So that's the second principle, return the revenue. And those of you who may have taken economics courses might recognize what that is. That's an attempt to, and a very important element of carbon pricing. What you're doing with the carbon price is encouraging substitution of the kind of energy sources that we want, the low carbon ones, and replacement, but we don't want the income effect. We do not want to hurt the economy or individual households with the price that we're imposing on carbon. So returning the revenue allows you to get the substitution effect without the income effect. And the third element is deliberative feedback. And that's a stabilizing idea, which means you actually adjust the policy as you go along. I studied engineering as an undergraduate, so feedback's a very familiar idea. But you can think of your thermostat in your house as a feedback mechanism. It keeps the temperature where you want it over time. There's an adjustment. The heater comes on in your house when it's needed and it goes off when it's not needed. So climate policy needs to be adjusted over time in a similar way. Deliberative feedback. Effective carbon pricing policy must provide predictable long-term price expectations with periodic incremental adjustments to reflect A, updated findings in the peer-reviewed climate science literature, and you can see why that's important because we're learning more about the climate science as we go along, and B, the observed effectiveness of carbon pricing and other policies in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. In other words, we look at how well the policy is working and adjust as we go along. And I want to point out that our next speaker, who may not be here yet, John Larson, has introduced a bill which encompasses all three of these principles. I've been watching climate legislation on Capitol Hill for about 3.5 years, pretty closely. I live on Capitol Hill. And there have been a lot of proposals out there. I haven't seen any that actually hit all three of those buttons as neatly and well as John Larson's proposal. And he's not somebody that you probably are too unfamiliar with because his district is right next to us. And he's also the fourth ranking Democrat in the House of Representatives. And he's the chair of the House Democratic Committee. So he's an important guy, and he's got a good piece of legislation that unfortunately didn't get much consideration when the rush to pass cap and trade was going on in the last 2 years. But we're hoping that this kind of thinking will be part of the new discussion about climate legislation that we're kicking off today. So with that, I'd like to just ask if there are any questions, since we have a minute or two, I think, before. Yes, go ahead.
I have a hundred that endorse the idea of coming to programs such as you're laying out here, but it would be nice to get it right. And I'm wondering what chance there will be for people who think that some of these things are not complete or not well specified to have some input at this late stage.
I certainly would welcome comments and conversation about the subject of this. This is an attempt to get a consensus without actually writing detailed legislation or, getting into the fine points about, for example, exactly what the carbon price should be or exactly what the tax code amendments might be. But the three elements are basically attempts to be a unifying message. I think I'm being urged to...
No. We have a few minutes because the congressman's on.
I'm sorry, I missed a cue.
We have an organization, 350.org.
Yes.
Knows where we need to get to. It doesn't have the nonsense about adjusting this, that, and the other. Surely the first principle should be to get to know 350.
Well, the first principle reflects the scientific consensus.
The second principle should be to stop using fossil fuels.
Thank you. Are there other questions or comments? Yes, go ahead. That helps, yeah.
How many pages long is Larson's bill?
Somebody help me. I think it's about 8. Yeah, 10. Kathy's saying 10. You can read it. It's actually on the Carbon Tax Center website. And believe it or not, I've never made it through the Waxman-Markey cap and trade bill. I've tried and I've fallen asleep and gotten ill and various other things have happened. But you can read the Larson bill, and you won't be done breakfast by the time it's over. So it's really quite an understandable bill.
Yes, thank you very much. What role do you see for the so-called RED program? In other words, carbon offsets to pay for standing forests that absorb carbon as a portion of the carbon tax or a carbon payment?
This is a very important subject, and in fact we have a workshop that's devoted to offsets and how they work and don't work. So I want to touch on this a little bit, but in the proposal that we have, we're not actually trying to do anything with international mitigation efforts to absorb carbon, for example, through forestry programs. This is a very important complementary policy that has to be built into effective climate policy in general. And in fact, that's perhaps one of the more appealing elements of the cap and trade legislation if the offsets work. What's been found, though, is there's a lot of gaming going on with offsets. And in fact, I read recently that something like 60% of the offsets in the European Union system are they are a result of destruction of one chemical, which is a byproduct of manufacturing of a hydrofluorocarbon, which is a refrigerant. And the article in the Economist asked the question, are the Chinese making this refrigerant in order to get the credits to destroy its byproduct? And I thought it was a silly question, because if you look at the price of allowances of offsets that they're getting for destroying each pound of that HFC, and that product is something like 10,000 times as potent a greenhouse gas as CO2. So it's the credit you would get for destroying, say, a ton of that is very, very large. The answer is obvious. They would, of course, they're making that stuff in order to get the credits. Why else would you make it? The value as an offset is probably 10,000 times what it is as a refrigerant. So this is the problem with offsets, is they invite gaming. But that's not to diminish the importance of funding forestry projects. We believe those do need to be funded.
The word food is missing.
Good point. Oh, thank you. Thank you. My audio guy is giving me a little cueing here. So what would you add about food?
Well, I think there seems to be some really good body of evidence out there that says that the CAFOs, factory farms that are out there are as much of a part of the problem as are the fuels that they burn.
I can't give you a super quantitative answer about that, but I can say that I have seen some comparisons of agricultural impacts with, for example, our general use of fossil fuels in the economy, and I can tell you that the fossil fuel component dwarfs everything else. It's true that there are ways to do agriculture that are far more climate friendly than the ways we are practicing it, and a carbon tax doesn't directly address the need for some kind of agricultural program to deal with that. And of course, you're talking about methane, which is 23 times as potent a greenhouse gas as CO2. So it is a serious problem. I wouldn't diminish it, but if you look at it in comparison to CO2, CO2 just dominates everything. And so this is, no one is saying this is the whole answer, but I think it's fair to say that there's a pretty strong consensus that if we don't address CO2 and we don't address it with a price mechanism, if we don't get to the point where green energy is cost competitive with the alternatives, we're just not going to make the shift. I've sort of had the weird experience of riding my bike along in DC and noticing more and more SUVs going by over the decades that I've been biking, and why is that? Well, cheap gasoline certainly has a lot to do with why we're using fuel the way we are.
Thank you, Jay.
Are we time-wise?
Time now.
Okay.
Thanks very much.